Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you all are, and welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter, hosted by Jim Fitzpatrick. Today, we will be looking at market updates and also having some discussions with some participants joining. But before we do that, let us go through the usual housekeeping rules. And first of all, I'd like to inform you that it is coming to you in English, but then with simultaneous translation into French. Please use the button at the bottom right corner of your screen of Zoom, or for those on Teams and other networks, you will receive it following the links that have been given to you. So for those on Zoom, please use the bottom link and then click on interpretation and then select the language of your choice. If you want to also hear the host, you leave the voice on. If you don't hear the sound coming from the host, you can also mute it. Again, we would also like to confirm to you that it's being recorded and the recordings are available to you through our networks. We also are coming to you on MS Teams, as I've indicated already. We are also live on YouTube and then Facebook Live. Let me, at this point, acknowledge our sponsors before the introduction of Jim Fitzpatrick. So we are sponsored, or the partners who have made this possible are Cashew Info, Cashew, CNFA, Pro Cashew Project, Tech Research Benin Cashew Project, Sustainable Nuts Initiative, SNI, and Intersnack Procurement. So at this point, let me also mention that this session is co-moderated by myself and Blessing Ocam. So Blessing, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Can you hear me? Hello, Ernest, can you hear me? Can you see me? I hope Ernest can hear me and can see me as well. I just want to confirm those before I proceed.
We can hear you, Blessing, I think.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next session of the Global Marketing with Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, I see you're already online and we are happy to have you again, and you may proceed with the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Blessing. Thanks, Ernest. Hello, everyone. Welcome to, this is our 10th iForum. Can you believe it? It's the last day of June. It's time to start looking back at the 2021 season. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a look at some of the talking points rather than doing a numbers heavy review of it. I think we did on the way of look at a few of the talking points. And then we have two very interesting guests today. One from Nigeria, Fassa Babatola. I'll tell you more about him later. And the second from Cote d'Ivoire, Alex Julian, Chief Operating Officer of SG Agro. Very interesting company, very interesting guy. We're going to hear from both of them later. And I'll tell you more about them at the end of these few slides, which are basically talking points. I wanted to ask you one thing. Why not get involved? Why not join in the conversation? These are talking points, so let's talk. And we would like you to encourage you to ask questions. So you can use the chat facility. There's a Q&A icon there you can use if you want to type your questions. If you want to ask your questions more personally, please feel free, raise your hand when the Q&A session starts. Raise it before then. Put questions in before then. You can put it into the text, no matter which one of the platforms you are on. Okay, so let's have a look, and we'll start with prices for, let's just try and locate where we are. First of all, on kernels, as we get to the end of June, you can see that the market has stuttered once or twice during the season. It's probably back up now in or around the prices where it was when we last spoke. But in the meantime, it did take a little dip. And you can see on kernels prices on the chart. So this dashed red line is the benchmark grade, the 320s. And we can see that 320s have been relatively steady in 2021, moving in a fairly narrow range once they picked up from the very low prices of last year, particularly the spring and again in August last year. Whole grades, on the other hand, we've seen move up. They also had a little bit of a wobble, if we could say it that way, in the last couple of weeks, but seem to have steadied up again. And generally speaking, the market for kernels looks, I wouldn't say this market looks particularly strong at this minute, but it looks steady. And if we just to put context on it, let's have a look over the period, the last 2 years or so. We've seen a high of $3.35 and a low of $2.75. And we've seen that twice. And I think in this case, we can probably discount the low as completely pandemic induced and probably without justification. So there we are on kernels, relatively steady market, up and down in a narrow range. Not too many questions, relatively quiet buying conditions. Everyone's trying to concentrate on getting their hands on the product they've already bought rather than on taking too many big decisions forward. What about RCN then? Well, RCN market has moved up a little bit since we last talked 2 weeks ago. You know, you get this situation at this time of year where the balance starts to shift. The first part of the year, the crop is in what we might call weak hands, economically weak hands, that is. Farmers, people forced to sell, people who just put the product through their hands quickly. Right now, it's evolving as it always does in the second half of the year into the hands of stronger holders. And probably now, the inventories of raw cashew nuts that are available are, I think it's fair to say, are in stronger hands than usual and probably more concentrated than usual, especially on the Vietnamese side. We're also seeing a situation where supply is reducing as the year goes on, and it appears that maybe there's a question mark over the crop in Guinea-Bissau. So reducing supply, I wouldn't say particularly increasing demand, but steady demand, and sellers are marking prices up a little bit. That's not to say that there's a lot of trade going on. All it's saying is that sellers see the opportunity to mark up their prices, and naturally they've been doing so. So the first of our talking points, and this is something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, this remarkable situation on freight. And you can see in the chart, that is a general picture of the freight cost. And just pick one, the China Containerized Freight Index. You can see how quickly that's moved up. The World Index and the Baltic Exchange Index in green. Incredible growth in freight cost. And this, of course, is, as we said before, this is double trouble for cashews. Really in a perfect storm on freight and logistics right now. We have this globalized, interconnected system that's been disrupted now for about 15 months. We have, they say, about 300 container ships waiting outside ports on any given day. And this is not something that's going to end anytime soon. And if we look at it from a cashew point of view, I've called it double trouble. And I call it double trouble because on the one hand, you have 80% dependence on a single origin. If you're in Europe, or if you're in the Middle East, or if you're in Japan or China or North America, you're almost entirely dependent on Vietnam for your supply of cashew kernels. There's major freight disruption in the location of that particular origin, as we know. But at the same time, Vietnam imports about 80% of its RCN. Now, a lot of that is from Cambodia, so this problem doesn't apply. But a lot more of it is from West Africa, where we may see increasing disruptions. And what we're seeing is question marks over the management of inventory. how does the famous just-in-time system fit in a crisis? And this is very difficult. Plus, we have the situation where importers, roasters have fixed price contracts, and they've, to a large extent, got fixed price contracts with very important retailers who expect those contracts to be delivered, and they can get squeezed in a very difficult situation. If we think of normal freight fluctuations, $700 per container, maybe it goes to $1,200 a container, but now we're talking about multiples of that, 10 times or more that, and this is a major problem. So this is a major talking point and a major difficulty, and it doesn't appear to be going away soon. One of the major lines, I think it was Maersk yesterday, said that they think that there will be disruption until the end of 2022. And we've seen, if you look at any of the publications, Lloyd's List, for example, they're talking about the markets entering a crisis, not ending a crisis, but that this is only beginning. So this needs to be watched very carefully. Second talking point I want to bring to your attention is basically the situation in Vietnam. So in Vietnam, we've got a number of things going on, but one of them is the rise in cases of COVID-19. Now, Vietnam, as of the day before yesterday, reported just over 16,000 cases, which is low. Let's not exaggerate the level of infections in Vietnam. 16,000 is very low by the standards of almost any other country, but it is increasing fast. Vietnam has a low level of vaccinations, probably because it had a low level of incidence of COVID-19 throughout last year and the early part of this year. So there's big question marks now with regard to, will restrictions on movement follow? How will this outbreak in Vietnam progress? Will the processing or exports be slowed down? Also, will imports be slowed? Will the movement of goods from the ports to the processing plants be slowed down? So there's huge talking points around COVID-19. Hopefully, this will be controlled quickly, and there won't be a major disruption, but we need to talk about it and we need to think about it. There are also questions with regard to RCN. Where are the inventories? Are they in West Africa, in Abidjan, for example, or are they being held in Vietnam? Who owns them? How strong a seller is the owner of the products? Are they capable of moving the market upwards? If they are, how far? How will processors react? And all of these things are interconnected. But there are certain facts. So indisputably, we know that exports of kernels from Vietnam are at record levels. We know that the crop was much lower than last year. Depending on who you talk to, it could be 300,000 or 350,000. I think it's probably closer to 300,000, but either way, it's not a huge difference. Imports are at a record level. As I said, Vietnam is 80% import dependent. Now, whether you accept the Cambodia numbers or not, and as you know, I don't, imports are still at a record level for the time of year. We should also recognize that in 2020, processing in Vietnam kept going very successfully. Record exports last year, record exports this year so far. So at this moment in time, we talk about talking points like COVID-19, and we think that, okay, yeah, there is a risk in Vietnam as anywhere else, but based on the facts, that risk would appear to be low at this point. But this pandemic changes rapidly, as we all know, and we need to keep a close eye on that. It is a talking point. Let's look at India, the other huge processing country, and let's look at the situation in India. So India is on the other side of the wave, if you like, the other side of the COVID wave. The economy is opening up, demand is returning. Many Indian scientists are saying there will be a third wave. Our experience in Europe would suggest that that is true. When will that be? And this is putting RCN buyers in a dilemma. So on the one hand, they could enter the market, buy, ship. Shipping will be a little bit slower than normal, as we know. They could buy now and the product could arrive into the middle of a third wave. It could be sitting in a port, it could be sitting in a warehouse, the factory may not be open. On the other hand, they could wait and miss an opportunity to buy in Guinea-Bissau or in Senegal or in the Gambia. And you'd have to say that already it's fairly clear that some of the lower prices have probably been missed by Indian buyers. So Indian buyers are in a difficult position. Vietnamese buyers continue to buy, they continue to show confidence, but Indian buyers have big decisions to make in the coming weeks. On what we know right now, on the facts, we know that Indian imports were, if you just look at the first quarter of this year, which is the latest official figures, you can see that imports are well down. But in actual fact, they're also higher than in 2019 or 2018. So we shouldn't draw too many conclusions from the fact that the first quarter of this year's imports were down. That could be a lot of different things. Secondly, we know that there was a slow start to the buying season in India due to the pandemic restrictions, which of course fits with the low early year imports. If we look at exports, exports are down, but we shouldn't be overly concerned about Indian exports. This is the continuation of a trend that's been ongoing for a number of years. I know in India, some people would like to see that reversed, and I'm sure some buyers would also like to see that reversed. But for now, a further decline in Indian exports is not altogether surprising. India is not a huge exporter of cashew kernels these days. 2020 may have caused India to lose some of its core markets, unfortunately, due to the pandemic restrictions in the early part of last year. And as we know, Indian demand can return very quickly. So India is a country where cashew kernels are normally bought and sold for prompt delivery. We don't see a lot of forward contracting. So as it switches back on, as demand comes back on, processing gears up and the market starts to move again. And then we'll see from an African perspective, we'll see then the reaction on the raw cashew nut market. But that should happen quickly if it's going to happen at all. So that has to be watched carefully. Talking point just on the general cashew chain, this goes for a lot of businesses. How will it change our business? There's no doubt that the pandemic is having a huge impact on business worldwide. And there's no doubt that will have a long-term impact on the cashew sector as well. So we see that risk is highlighted. When people personally feel in jeopardy, when businesses see their supply chains disrupted, they start to look at their risks a little bit more closely, and they started to consider how they might manage that risk. And in our case, cashew nuts, cashew nut kernels especially, we look at particular risks, very high dependence on a single origin, risk of very long supply chains from Africa to Vietnam or to India, and then back out to consuming countries. We look at things that have been evolving for many years, but appear to be accelerated due to the pandemic, and I think will likely be much more important in the coming year. Transparency and traceability in the chain, a need for more agility. So at the end of the day, when it comes to a supply chain crisis, what you might look for as a buyer is that the next time that threat arises, that your supply chain is a little bit more agile, a little bit more able to cope. And that's got to be a talking point, and that could have repercussions, positive or negative, but it could have repercussions for the African cashew processing sector. I think they'll be positive if African cashew processors, or if enough African cashew processors are in a position to take advantage of the situation and develop their business. So let's have a look at the RCN business again, and let's have a look at supply and trade between major African exporting countries and Vietnam in the early part of 2021. So I took 4 countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania. I took them as an example because in 2019, they accounted for about 68% of Vietnam's imports. Most of the rest came from Cambodia. By the end of May 2021, imports from these 4 countries were up by 67% on the 2019 figures. And as you can see on the table, we took the 3 years, 19 in blue, 20 in orange, 21 in gray. And I think perhaps we should discount 2020 for obvious reasons to a certain extent and just focus on the gap between 2021 and 2019. So what we're seeing is more purchases by Vietnam, more shipments. So these are shipments, these are imports. More shipments, more arrivals into Vietnam from Cote d'Ivoire, a little bit less from Ghana, quite a bit less from Nigeria, and a lot more from Tanzania. So all in all, from these 4 major origins, which accounted for 68% of 2019 imports, we see a very large rise. So it's not just an increase in imports from Cambodia that are making a difference to Vietnam's RCN import market. So if we look at this, let's ask ourselves why. Why would Vietnamese buyers buy more and buy them earlier? First of all, they knew they had a short crop, clearly. And they knew that before any of the rest of us, naturally enough, so they should. And they acted. Secondly, they knew, as we all knew, as we talked about back in February, that there were major forward sales, as there always are, on kernels. So all serious exporters of kernels will have a forward sales book. All buyers need to buy forward. That's the way we manage risk. They may also have known that there was going to be an improved demand in China. We don't know if that's come as a shock to Vietnamese processors or if it was something they expected. We do know, if you were with us the last time, you will have seen that China's imports from Vietnam are more than double. I think it was up 234% on the previous year, even taking into account the losses of some weeks in 2020. That's a massive increase in China. That may have been one aspect that stimulated earlier and more volume buying. How did this happen? How did they do it? First of all, they bought more in Tanzania, a lot more in Tanzania. As you can see on the chart, it's looking like about 3 times what they bought last year. And if you look back at 2019, no, it's not just a mistake. Vietnam bought only 180 tons, or imported 180 tons in the early part of 2019 from Tanzania. All imports were in the previous year, 2018. So what we're seeing is an increase. I think it was 57,000 tons in 2020. It's 144,000 tons so far this year from Tanzania. And that's probably the end of it, as most sales in Tanzania are done. So large scale buying in Tanzania was a major factor. They also, there's been a change to fewer, larger deals in Cote d'Ivoire. So the approach has been bigger deals, bigger purchases, fewer buyers. And this has an impact on the market, of course. And the impact is clearly, first of all, an intensification of competition. So this is very evident in Cote d'Ivoire. We're going to hear from Julian later, and he can tell us more about the situation during the season there. But what we've certainly seen is that processors have struggled more this year than they would have done in last year or the previous year, as exporters struggled to cover their export commitments. And it's also created greater volatility at the farm gate, but probably, at least for the early part of the year, lower volatility in the international RCN chain. So you really do have to start asking questions about the impact of this. You really do have to ask yourself, well, does this scenario of an increase in imports from West Africa and from East Africa, does this fit with the idea that Cambodia has already supplied about 1 million tons to Vietnam? And clearly it doesn't. If Cambodia really had supplied 969,000 tons of kernels, as the figures say, why would they buy all of this material too? It just doesn't make any sense. So there's clearly a problem with those figures. But the major point I'm trying to make here is that if we look at the situation in Vietnam, they're much better covered than they have been in earlier years. They, yes, certainly have more exports of kernels, but perhaps this position on supply and the calmness in buying and the calmness in prices is justified based on what we've seen this year. But there's also a major change. We have one major buyer buying very large volumes, and that has an impact. And the impact is not simply that there are fewer contracts, fewer traders. The impact is that it may well actually be contrary to the interests of processors in the individual exporting countries, particularly Cote d'Ivoire. And it may actually be an imbalance in policy to support big deals, major exports, may well make the disposal of RCN simpler, but it may well actually make the long-term goal of the development of processing more difficult. And that's a question that time will tell. And we will see that question arise in Tanzania in the coming season from October. There are a number of investments planned there. How they will fare in coping with that kind of competition between, they will be able to buy directly, but to cope with that competition from the auction will be very interesting and very revealing. So this is a major talking point as to how that change in the way of purchasing will impact the market and particularly impact local stakeholders in each of the exporting countries. That's the first talking point on the West African, East African cashew segment. Second talking point is production, and we'll have a quick look here. Our two guests will tell us more about their countries, but in general, if we look at I do this on the basis of I take a survey of surveys, if you like. I take a look at all of the estimates, and I look at the low estimates, and I look at the high estimates, and I try to come to something that makes sense. And if we look at this, what we're seeing now is a very small difference between the high and low estimates. So we're coming now to let's say, to a conclusion on what the crop is. And the only place where you might see a difference at the moment really is in Guinea-Bissau. So the question in Guinea-Bissau would be whether or not the exports through the port, expected to be about 150,000 tons, whether or not that actually represents the entire crop. In other words, how much has gone across the land borders for export through other countries. So that's a big question and a big talking point that's arising. But overall, if we look at production in West Africa, I don't see a major variation on last year. When I look at it, I look at the estimates for 2021 at the high end, up by about 28,000 tons. I think we can probably discount that now. At the low end, down by about 123,000 tons. And if we compare it to 2019, which might be a better gauge, the high end of this year's estimates will be up 8% and the low end around about 1.4%. So if we look at this situation, I think that probably production in West Africa is similar to last year, give or take 50 to 100,000 tons. There's no crisis in supply, there's no oversupply, movement of product has been faster. And it looks as if the season is being, within the circumstances, pretty well managed by the export trade. There is a big question, I think this is the real talking point, is the production growth in West Africa beginning to slow? Now, we do know that we're likely to see an increase in Ghana from 2020 onwards due to new plantings, work that's been going on for some years. But on the other hand, if we look a little bit more forward and we think about aging trees in Cote d'Ivoire, particularly in Guinea-Bissau, but also in Benin. If we look at the delivery of inputs in Tanzania, we've seen a dramatic fall from spectacular rise to a dramatic fall in production in Tanzania in the last season. Is that down to inputs, as some farmers groups say? Is it the weather? Is there some other reason? We were all expecting that Tanzania would come up with a crop in excess of 300,000 tons this year. The latest official figure is close to 200,000 tons. There are projects in place. How effective, how fast, how quickly can the renewal of trees in Cote d'Ivoire, where trees are just beginning to come to a stage now where they may need renewing, in Mozambique, where they've been in that position for some years, and in Benin, where that position has been there for some years and hasn't yet been sufficiently addressed. Are there new plantings in Nigeria? And particularly, given that we're coming out of a period of very low prices for RCN, 2018, 19, and 20, very low prices, particularly at the farm gate. What's the impact of that? Has that stalled new plantings? Has it stalled improvements in on-farm practice? Are we looking at a situation where the engine of growth in production of cashews, which is West Africa, is beginning to slow down? And if it is, what's being done about it? And if it's not been done, why not? And can it actually be addressed? Is this a problem that can be addressed? Because if it's not addressed, that situation that we've discussed on this webinar once or twice over the last 10 episodes, where demand is rising quickly and it catches production growth in the next 5 to 10 years, that could come quicker and it could come much more dramatically. So if we think in the long term, this would be a major talking point in African countries. Now, it might be that all these projects will turn around and say, well, look, actually, don't worry, this is in hand, this is happening. We'll see. It is a talking point. Let's have a look around different countries then on the continent of Africa. Let's have a look and talk about Cote d'Ivoire, the impact of these fewer, bigger deals. So this year we saw major export deals, and then we saw local trade organizations and traders try to cover the product. It led to a very volatile position. It led to a situation where processors had difficulty securing raw material at the right time. That's nothing new, but I think it was more acute this year. People who seemed to be ready still had some difficulties. So a lot of people missed the opportunity. And you would really have to wonder about the management of the sector if you think about, on the one hand, supporting processing through subsidy and policy in a spectacularly positive way. Let's be clear about that. But on the other hand, facilitating a structure in the RCN trade that makes that less effective. How is that balance managed? That's a big talk. For me, that's the big talking point. And we could see this situation spread. We could see this problem in other countries. If we look in Guinea-Bissau, talking point is this production problem that we've seen over the last 2 years? First of all, is it real or is it just an expression of smuggling? I think it's real. Secondly, is this about the age of the trees? Is it about climate change? Or is it just the weather in the last 2 growing seasons? Is there a fundamental structural problem in Guinea-Bissau? That's a big talking point. I think that there probably is a situation where there's need for thinning, there's need for improvement of trees, there's need for new planting, question mark, which varieties to plant. What will Guinea-Bissau cashew sector, which is really important in terms of its supply, somewhere around about 200,000 tons, not in the last 2 years, but in the past, and we'd hoped in the future. Is there a problem? What can be done about that problem? Is anything being done about that problem that will have an impact quickly enough? We look at the situation in processing. Now, what we've seen this year, and this is It's due to a number of factors, but it's largely due to the sharp increases in freight from Asian countries to Europe and to the United States. It's largely due to a restriction in supply due to those logistics problems, longer voyages, lack of availability of containers. But what we have seen in Cote d'Ivoire, in Benin, and I guess too in Burkina, is we've seen processors being able to make sales of kernels at very high prices, around $3.40 for WW320s, compared to top processors in Vietnam in the teens, anywhere between 310 and 320, and probably more if you look at a forward position. Can these gains be sustained? Is this just a situation of a single year anomaly, or is this a situation where these processors who are qualified, these would be processors, those who've made the gains would be processors who have their food safety right, who have their product presentation right, who have their marketing right, and know how to negotiate and to market? Can they hold on to those gains? Can others join them? And that's really a big question. This is, in a way, tragic and unfortunate, but it has thrown up this opportunity for processors in West Africa. Some of them have taken hold of it. Can they hold on to it is the question. I think that's a big talking point for the future. We come back to the problem similar to Guinea-Bissau. This problem of aging trees and tree renewal is a much broader issue that's coming down the tracks at us over the next 10 years. How is it to be managed? And in Tanzania, so now we see, in my opinion, very positive move in Tanzania. That is that processors can source directly from farmers or primary cooperatives. How will that change the relationship between new processors? Because I think it will give rise to new processors. How will the farmers benefit? How will that relationship develop? Will the direct sourcing be able to compete with the auction? It looks like a very positive development. How will it fold out? How will it change the sector remains to be seen. And secondly, in Tanzania, and bear in mind, Tanzania is really important as a producer in the Southern Hemisphere. We've only got about 18% of the world's crop at that time of year between October and January. With Brazil now very restricted in production, not really growth in Indonesia, some problems in Mozambique. Tanzania becomes a center both for processing, should do, and for sourcing of RCN, it already is. Question mark is, this decline in production that we've seen in the last 2 years, is that due to the inputs distribution system, which it may well be, and many say it is, and is that system fit for purpose? Does that system need a significant reform? And I think the government is looking at this, but frankly, there's been 3 or 4 different versions of this system over the years. And from what I understand, it's not working. How can that change? This is a big talking point. So when we look at the talking points in the African cashew sector, what we're seeing is a real mix between talking points on production, on regulation, and on trade. And all of these things, a lot of them have been there for many years, but what's happening is that they're coming more and more to the fore as the position of Africa as a producer increases, and particularly at the moment where the pandemic focuses all of us on the weaknesses in the supply chain. And if we look at how that chain is managed, and we look at sector supports and we look at regulation in the sector, I think we come to a number of talking points on regulation that have been highlighted this year. The impact of direct subsidies, the supply chain interventions, access to finance, the linkage of processors or exporters to farmers, technical support, and I put in tax concessions. Not that that's topical, but it is part of the regulatory environment. If we look at direct subsidies, we've seen that they've been very effective in Cote d'Ivoire, but long term, how effective will they be? They can't keep going forever. I think they're there for 5 years from the startup. Does it encourage efficiency, or does it help businesses to become established? So far, it helps businesses to become established. Longer term, it remains to be seen. Supply chain interventions by governments, notoriously difficult to implement, but they have thrown up a lot of difficulties this year. Export windows, how do they work? Well, they work in some places and not in others. That's clearly the case. Prices, how do you set prices? What influence does one or two very large buyers have on the setting of prices? And the more you consolidate the trade, as my opinion on the RCN trade is, it's kind of anarchic, but the more you consolidate it, you have to start to consider what influence a very few buyers might have on minimum price regulation, for example. What influence those buyers might have on policy. Can governments get caught between the interests of their processors and their own export trade and the interest of major buyers? Much more difficult to manage in a case where you have a few very large contracts, a few very large buyers. Access to finance, this is not exclusive to the cashew sector, but it is acute in the cashew sector. The information available to financial institutions and to banks is a weakness in our sector. The risk profile of cashew processing compared to trading in and export of RCN, the risk profile is high by comparison. A lot of the preconceptions held by financial institutions, I know from my own interaction with them, a lot of the preconceptions are 5 years or more out of date. They often don't understand processing, how it works, or the opportunity in it. And therefore they tend quite naturally to go for what they see as a lower risk activity. So what are we doing to make them understand the risk profile of cashew processing as compared to RCN trading? The linkage to farmers. So is this being done? We know that better linkage by processors to the grower of the product in any product is an effective way of managing the supply chain. It often means that farmers get a better deal. It often means they get better technical support. It often reduces the volatility in the sector. So whereas we can't really complain from a farmer's perspective, if we were to take that perspective, we can't really complain that prices for the cashews they produce have been poor on average over the last 10 to 15 years. In fact, they've been very positive and they've moved up. But what is very difficult to manage from a farmer's point of view, I mean, we're talking here about some of the poorest farmers in the world. What's very difficult for them to manage is this volatility. Better linkage, better understanding, maybe a spread out of the risks and benefits might encourage more growing, might encourage farmers to look after the trees and might improve their incomes. Technical support, this is a big question too. This is a big talking point now. If more factories are built, how are they maintained? How are they supported? Are the people available? The managers, the technicians, the mechanics to service the machines, spare parts, and so on. And when we look at these factors, all of those 5 that we've mentioned are highly impacted by regulation and by government action in the sector. It may be beginning, but the pace is very slow, and processors are still left very much depending on services from overseas and from very far away. And that's an issue, and that's an issue which should ultimately end up with an African cashew machine building industry. But for now, it will be enough to have an industry that would service the machines and manage the spare parts. Tax concessions, I won't dwell on. Tax concessions are available everywhere. They are an important part of the incentives, but they're relatively similar across the sector. So we have big talking points here. We have talking points related to policy. We've talking points related to long-term production. We've talking points related to the short-term management of the RCN supply chain. Plenty to talk about. So let's go to our guests, and let us start. Let us start in Cote d'Ivoire with Alex Julian. Alex is the Chief Operating Officer of SG Agro, a business that I have some knowledge of, a business that's built on high levels of expertise, tremendous commitment, professionalism, and Alex is a man with plenty of international experience, and he's putting together one of the best factories in Cote d'Ivoire in a carefully constructed strategy that's based on experience and technical know-how. Mr. Julian, are you with us?
Yes.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, Jim. How are you?
I'm very well indeed. Thanks very much for joining us this morning, or I think it's this afternoon where you are. It's good to hear from you. Tell us about the season in Cote d'Ivoire perhaps from a processor's point of view. How did the season evolve this year, and what was your experience of it?
Well, thank you for your invitation, and pleasure to talk with you and all the participants. Well, I think you have a very technical and a professional analysis based on the situation of 2021. Effectively, as a processor, we have advantage, opportunities, and also the impact of supply of raw materials, some volatilities, and unstable supply. I think it's normal somehow. You know, the opportunity always accompanied with also the risks and difficulties. First of all, I think a lot of information on the market at the beginning of the crop, some of them are right, correct, but some of them maybe too much impactive side, like you know, the bad crop of Vietnam, shortage of raw cashew nuts over there, quality was bad, which was also somehow right, but when people spread all these information on the market can also influence, as we all know, on the market, so make the price of RCN higher, and also the buying very, very strong on the market. So all these impacts the quality even from the farmers when the how to say it, the control of the situation is still weak. So I think as a processor from this side, a lot of influence from the supply, whatever the quality, whatever the price. But as also the processor on the supply chain, we benefit somehow the strategy changes from the buyer side, like European and American buyers put much more attention on the supply from African processors. So whatever the forward contracts, spot sales, and also the prices are also advantage for the processors. So I think as a processor, we need to take advantage of supply chain changes strategically on the markets to strengthen us with more healthy management of processing. One side, we need also to make the industrial development more complete, because I mean, in Vietnam, the industry is much more developed, always most even developed in the world. They have also the supply chain, like the packaging materials. They have also the market, like energy using the shell, and also the labor qualification. I think the supply chain changing so allowed African processors to take some time, as soon as possible, when I see, to build up a more complete industry, not only in the processing side. It allowed us to go further, more healthy, and also to take a sustainable development in the processing industry in Africa. We started to have some technical support side, like you mentioned also in the PPT, that SG Agro was a new factory. So for the first year, we cannot feel so much impact on the machineries problem, but more and more management should be involved in the coming years. So it's also a big challenge for us to set up or make the supply of spare parts more stable, to have a better performance in long term. So some points from my side, Jim.
Thank you. And you make a really great point in general there, that the building of an industry is not just the building of a series of factories. It is the building of an industry and all the services that are needed to support it, including, and especially maybe at the beginning, training of labor and management. Do you think that as this season goes on, let's say we're about halfway through the year now, do you think that this has been a beneficial year for the cashew sector in Cote d'Ivoire? Do you think there's been steps forward?
Yes, but we have to analyze in the details, because as I mentioned, some advantage happened, but also some difficulties happened. Definitely, I think it makes the African processors to have a more complete vision in the industry, to see how they can strengthen their supply side. Like we mentioned, how to build up a sustainable partnership with the farmers, and also how to work with the governments of the supply chain to make the raw materials more stable, more reasonable price, and also the moment to buy the raw cashew nuts also very important. But the difficulties is from the market unstable. So I think in the coming years we can find the solution to facing all these impacts.
I like your phrase, complete vision. I mean, the idea of, it's often neglected, and not only in Cote d'Ivoire, or not only in Africa, but the idea of integrating a supply chain, the process and the process support, and the marketing and markets, for me is the key to success. It's been done brilliantly in Vietnam. It took about 20 years to achieve in terms of processing and export. There's a lot we can learn. Let's stay with us, Thanks very much for the moment. I'm just going to go to our guest from Nigeria, Mr. Fasaru Babatola, who has, I hope he doesn't mind if I describe him as a veteran in the cashew sector. He was president of the National Cashew Association of Nigeria for a number of years. There's his smiling face on the video, which is great to see. Chairman of Colossus Investment, a man with experience in cashews, in banking, in a whole range of commodities, and president of the African Cashew Alliance. Tola, how are you?
Very well. Thank you, Jim, for promoting me so highly. I'm grateful.
You promote yourself.
You
I
are the
just tell the
guru.
story.
You are the guru of cashew. We look up to you.
Well, thanks very much. You and I could we could sit here complimenting each other, or we could talk about cashews. Let's talk about cashews. How was the experience in Nigeria this year? What's the current situation in Nigeria on the export and on processing of cashews?
Well, this year, in terms of, it was a bit different in the sense that we had a crop. The crop came out quite earlier and quite good in terms of quality and quite commendable. And then even the handling, at the farm gate, also something to cheer about, because thank God that a good job was done, particularly in the in the drying of the cashews. We find our farmers drying up to like 7% this year, and thank God they did that, because we had huge logistics problem in Nigeria this year. I mean, one that we've never seen before. In fact, at the point, the Ports Authority suspended export for like 2 weeks. So we had a lot of cargoes, just waiting, not being able to get into the port terminal. But so far so good. The reports from the destination point have been quite good. And we are happy. We're really, really happy about that, and grateful to our farmers and those handling the cargoes at the farm gate. Right now, the season is already almost winding up, but of course we still have a lot of some of these stockists who held on to the cashews, believing that the market will be good, and I think some of them have started to offload now to the market. But relatively, it went well, except for the pain in the area of logistics.
So there's still some product to be sold.
Yeah, definitely. There are some pockets of cashews, but the demand is very, very strong. Definitely,
yeah,
it's not
it's
the market.
Certainly,
and the response from the buying countries have been very, very good. Nigerian cashews have really come of age. We're quite happy about it.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot of good things about improvements in quality. Is that due to just better drying, or is it due to new varieties, or is it a mixture of all of these things?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Over the past 9-10 years, we've done a lot of campaign for cashew, for quality, and even for production. We saw cashews volume move from 2011 from about 90,000 tons to about 260. This year. So we've seen a lot of new plantations that have come up. A lot of people went into the crop. In 2013, cashew was listed as one of the transformational crops under the agricultural transformation agenda of the then government. So, and from the work that we did, making people know that there was money and there was cash in cashew. So a lot of people went in there. So I'm seeing that we have a lot of the new plantations, high yield and better quality cashews now coming out, which I think has helped in the sustenance of the quality in Nigeria. And of course, a very good post-harvest handling processes have been, that has been helpful as well. So you see that even year in, year out, you hardly see 1 year, the previous year's cashew mixing with the other one. So most of the cashew year in, year out have been sold. So it's when you have 1 year, you have a challenge, and then you're not able to move out most of the cashews. Definitely, you're going to see it play out in the next year. So we've been, the responses from the buying countries have been good. So most of the cashews have been offloaded. So that's it.
That's encouraging. And
thank you, sir.
Longer term, you expect to see production rise in Nigeria?
Well, we are barring any climate problem, we should see the production rise in Nigeria, definitely, because a lot of people have gone into cashew plantations. Definitely.
That's good news. There's definitely a market out there for them.
Yeah.
What about processing in Nigeria? Has it made any steps forward in the last year?
Well, one can say that, well, a lot of the processors have been struggling. But we also have new ones coming in with better and more efficient equipment. And I see a lot more of new entrants into the market. Definitely, the finance environment also is looking more friendly, with the likes of BOI also wanting to support. Now there's a better understanding, unlike the way it was before, better understanding of the finance community about cashews now. So a lot more of them, the banks, the development banks, are trying to come in. Even the Nigerian Export Promotion, Nigeria Export-Import Bank, and some of the commercial banks are looking at cashew as one commodity they can put in money. So I think that processing will get better, and then we're also looking at policies also from the government side that would also help the processing of cashew. So I think in Nigeria, and indeed the whole of Africa, there are going to be brighter days and better days for processing and value addition. Yeah, definitely.
Good. I like it. A nice optimistic outlook. Thank you very much, Tola. I'll return you to Ernest. We're going to have a question and answer session now. So if you've got any questions or any comments, feel free, all participants on all platforms, to add them. Ernest, let me hand back to you for some questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks so much, Tola, and also Alex, for the insights you are giving. There are a couple of questions here, but then I go first to Alex, and then also Tola can answer this. What factories are today operating in Cote d'Ivoire, and what are the competitive edge that these factories have? Because we know there has been COVID, and we know most factories are likely to have had some kind of a shock or the other. But then for those of you that are able to operate, what has been the unique advantage that you possess, which allowed this to happen? And then maybe the question also wanted to know how many other factories are operating there, and what percentage or what volume of raw cashew nuts they are processing annually, probably even what they processed last year. So let me keep it this way, Alex.
Thank you for your question. I think my figures maybe regarding the whole processing quantity could not be accurate, so I cannot announce any figures. But our factory, SG Agro, is with a capacity of 24,000 metric tons yearly with 2 shifts. In things last 3 years, we do see more and more like at least 5 factories like this kind of scale capacity is happen, or they are going on to open the factory in every coast. So I think the processing industry is really developing very fast in every coast.
Thank you, Alex. Tola, any idea on the volumes that are being processed in Nigeria today, and really whether the factories are able to undertake the processing business, and what those that are working today, what kind of advantages you think they have?
Well, from the Nigerian side, I think it's been a bit of a challenge competing. I think the issue with them is being able to compete, globally. And so you find a lot of them struggling. And you see some of them now taking advantage of the local market. And I see that happening now. Of course, Nigeria, by virtue of its population and the what you call relatively moderate per capita income, creates a very, very robust market for any processing, for any cashew processing company. So what I see is that we see a lot of them now coming in, going to the supermarket, and they seem to be doing quite well in that area. But I think that as we strengthen strengthen their capacity in terms of access to markets in to America and Europe and these other more sophisticated markets, I think they'll be able to play more in terms of export. But in terms of domestic business, the processors are doing quite well. But I see that they're not doing as much in terms of the export, as compared to what they're doing locally. But I feel as we work all together to put them at to function at a more comparative, at a level of comparative advantage, then we'll see them pushing up. I think we're working on that together at the ACA level, and that policy framework that gives them that advantage, we are working towards that, so that each of these governments in Africa will make a cashew sector, particularly cashew value addition sector, to be one that is preferred and supported. That will make them to be able to stand, shoulder to shoulder with the companies set up in India and Vietnam. So I think with the work of advocacy, keep going on to see that they have competitive advantage through the kind of finance they have, through infrastructure and all that. Like the meeting we had with the African Development Bank today, a lot of they're looking at also developing what they call the special processing zones, which we have the power already put there, the infrastructure already put there, and then of course giving them the training, the capacity development, all these ones. It's a joint effort. It's all of us putting our hands on the table to see that the necessary strength is granted these companies so that they can really deliver on all fronts, both international and in terms of export and in terms of the domestic market.
Thank you very much. The next question actually, I think, goes a lot more to Alex about how the question is to know how is food safety aspects being managed in the factories in Africa, and is there a particular standard being followed with expansion in production, food safety standards become a concern for both buyers and sellers. So maybe Alex, you can also tell us how you're addressing food safety aspects in your factory, and then also what standards you are following.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really very good question to the African processors, because when we supply our cargoes or products to the markets, especially to European market and American markets, we have to standardize the same vision as the customer on the markets. So as Jagro, we are based on BRC standard to build up the factory. So my suggest to the African processors is to build up a standard of the food safety before you build up the factory. Once your factory is built up, it will be difficult to change it, to adapt to the standard of what you want. So we are based on the BRC standard. Of course, at the beginning, we didn't have it, and we had a lot of difficulties to stabilize the procedures of operations. But at least the infrastructure side, we are ready for it. And the soft management are also very important to implement these standards in the factory. I think through the efforts of my team, and little by little, we are adapting to this standard of BRC. And hopefully we can get it this year. And I think the BRC side is a quite high level of food safety. So I think all the details, even the, you know, how you put the product on the pallets, and how you how to say it, mobilize the workers to respect the hygiene of the productions, and also the qualification of the working capacity, are all these details to define how you can reach the food safety level. This is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. And now we might shift more to your end. The question has to do with the presentation you did, and it is more to find out what in your analysis is accounting for the increase in the cashew kernels from Cote d'Ivoire, and indeed not only from Cote d'Ivoire, but also from the West African sub-region. If you can elaborate a bit on that.
Well, we have, first of all, an increase in processing capacity. More factories being built. These factories are being built largely with current modern food safety standards in mind. So rather than adapting older factories to modern food safety factories, these factories are built with food safety in mind, and that means that they are ready and they're qualified to supply the market. Secondly, I think the short term this year is a factor of location. So shorter voyage times, closeness to market, lower freight rates, of course, is a factor too. This encourages buyers to engage with West African processors. And we are seeing an increase. Now, we have to take into account that we've had 2 very difficult years, and it is difficult to operate a factory under restrictions, as anyone who's been in one under these situations knows. But we've still seen an increase. The question for me is, it's pretty clear why we've seen an increase, at least in the short term, in the export of cashew kernels. But we should temper that by noting that the market share in the European market and in North American market, both of which have been growing, the market share remains relatively stable and quite low. It's, I think, less than 7% in Europe, less than 3% in the United States. So it's important to realize that this growth is only, as we might say, scratching the surface of the opportunity. If we see continued positive encouragement to processing by good regulatory environments, and particularly, to my mind, the three things that are essential. One, integration of the processing plants into the supply chain, and that's best done with public cooperation, but it's best done by private companies. Secondly, the continued development of food safety standards. And thirdly, the development of better management and better training in the factories. I think buyers would be happy to see more products from West Africa and to see West African factories become more competitive. Competitiveness isn't built too quickly, but at least by processing locally, you prepare a fresher product, origin processed, more easily traceable, more easily identifiable in the process, and generally a more controllable chain. So you eliminate part of that cost of moving that product all that way to Vietnam, for example, for processing. And if you can eliminate that cost, then you have something to play with in your processing cost. So you have to come in within the margins of the cost of moving the product to Asia for processing. Buyers will definitely support that, I think, and this is an opportunity to build confidence. So there's no clear, easy answer to the question as to why kernels exports are increasing, but it is the culmination of a number of years of trends, and particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, the idea that factories are supported has definitely encouraged a lot of investment. And we would hope that once the pandemic passes, that those factories will gear up to their capacity, in which case by that time, based on the capacity that we can see, we could see a doubling of kernels exports from Cote d'Ivoire. Elsewhere, the situation is a little bit different. In Benin, for example, some of the factories are struggling. In Guinea-Bissau, some of those smaller factories are struggling too. But we see very positive news from Burkina, positive news from Cote d'Ivoire. We see the possibility of significant investment in Tanzania. So I'm quite optimistic that, as I said, I think in one of these forums earlier, I do think that this time it is different, and that this time we will see sustained export of kernels from African countries. Ernest.
Yes, Jim, just to continue on that point, there is a question, it's more with the presumption that probably the increased processing is also as a result of pressure coming out of the fact that the supply chain is too long and needs to be shortened. And the questioner wants to find out whether West Africa can actually gain an advantage over Asian countries when it comes to the European market, given this long supply chain, which apparently the awareness is beginning to grow to shorten.
Well, I mean, it is difficult to see processing costs in West Africa get as low as processing costs are in Vietnam. It is difficult to see that, at least in the short term. However, there is this saving of the movement of the raw material, which offsets some of the cost differential. So I think that African processing can be competitive. What we're seeing now is really the first generation of large-scale, well-managed, properly financially structured businesses developing using modern technologies. I would expect that there will be further improvement in the technology, and I hope that those African cashew factories continue to have access to that. But I see no reason why that competitiveness gap in terms of the financial cost and processing inputs cannot be bridged. And then comes into play all of the other advantages: a more sustainable supply chain, a shorter supply chain, a supply chain that's more in harmony with consumers' demands and buyers' needs for the European and potentially the North American market. So it should happen. It's been tried. We know it's failed in the past, and we know for various reasons that that's happened. But I think it is really a situation now with the onset of good processing technology and the interest of not only national companies, but international companies in the investment, and governments with their eyes open to the cashew sector. And if we can also see, as Tola reported on Nigeria, improved interaction with banks and financial institutions, then I see no reason why West African cashew processors should not be the natural supplier, certainly to the European industry, if not to the European and North American industry.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have another question here, which is focusing on Tanzania. During the talking points on Africa, you had also mentioned whether indeed the input distribution system is fit for purpose. And the question is asking what recommendations you will make, looking at the way even the way the raw cashew nut collection system, the whole marketing system is structured, whether you have any recommendations for Tanzania. Tough one.
Wow, that's a tough one. Well, first of all, I think we should highlight the fact that the supply of inputs is important, and it is the difference between a good crop and a very good crop in Tanzania. And we have seen already the potential for crops in excess of 300,000 tons. And we would expect that the crop will get a little bit larger in Tanzania, but the crop is volatile. And I think that's, at least I'm informed, that that's due to the poor operation of the input system. So it needs regulation. I would personally feel, but it's a personal opinion, that it's a private sector activity, that ideally, not immediately, but ideally as time goes on and more processes are established, which I expect to happen, that it would be linked or integrated into the supply chain so that processors can also support the distribution of inputs. I think this needs, as a first step, it needs political will to do something about it. It needs, and we have seen a lot of changes in Tanzania, and I again mentioned this key change that allowing processors to source their cashew nuts legally directly from farmers and primary co-ops is a huge step forward. I'm not going to tell the government of Tanzania how to do their business. I'm certainly not going to tell them if they haven't asked, but I think that a private sector regulated commercial system for the distribution of inputs, and if any subsidies are necessary, that those would be delivered initially directly through the inputs, but in the longer term, as processing is re-established in Tanzania. And let's not forget, at one time, Tanzania was a powerhouse of processing. We may have to go back 45 years, but it was the case, that it should be linked then to the processors. That it's a really great question, and I'm not doing it justice, but for what it's worth, that's what I think.
Well, I mean, for what it's worth, it's also a good answer you've given. And I'll move to Alex and Tola. There's a question here to find out how optimistic they are for the coming years, given that you've also mentioned that the trees in Africa are aging, and there are a number of factors which potentially may impact on production. Whether they still have, they are still optimistic in terms of sustainability of supply to factories and even for export in their different countries. So maybe I'll start with Alex, looking at Cote d'Ivoire, whether he's, again, looking at his own supply networks and the challenges in obtaining raw materials, whether he has high optimism for the coming years.
Thank you for the question. I think with all the changes of the supply chain for the coming years, I have very much confidence to see whatever the capacity of of the competition on the markets, or also the developments in the Ivory Coast with the support from whatever the local governments, with also the supply chain of raw materials, and as well as the technical support well implemented in Ivory Coast, and also with the financial support more and more favorable to the processors. I'm very confident to have a very successful industry in Ivory Coast in the coming years.
Thank you very much. Tola, if you could also tell us the situation in Nigeria and whether, given the way the season panned out this year, whether you still are optimistic. The question also wants to know this against the background that trees are aging and probably the supply of raw cashew nuts might not be able to catch up with the demand and also be sufficient enough to sustain processing locally on the continent.
Thank you very much, Ernest. I believe that sustainability for cashews will be guaranteed by our ability to, in Africa, our ability to be able to be, to a large extent, have some control in the market. Control in the sense that we are able to process, Africa is able to process what it produces. That in itself guarantees, some kind of confidence for the farmers. As you noticed, from what we saw the last 2 years, based on the pandemic, we're grateful to God for Vietnam for the ability to manage the pandemic very well, which gave Africa that continued window for export of the raw cashew nuts. So we are saying if the case has been different, that a total blockage and stoppage in Vietnam, same way you saw in India, it will have a backlash, on the farmers and the ability to produce. So as long as there is guaranteed market, and which I think by our positioning ourselves as a processing continent, not just a producing continent, the processing continent, we are reinforcing, the fact that yes, this market is sustainable and competitive, and then our farmers will be guaranteed the market. And then, of course, with that, there will be a fair price. As long as there's fair price, there will be enough incentive, enough motivation for the farmers, not only to grow the cashews, but also to keep it in its best condition. And I think with all the efforts that everybody is putting in right now, I believe 5 years down the line will be better than where we are right now. Meaning, the processing capacity will have increased, and then of course, competitiveness will be more guaranteed, sustainability also will be more guaranteed. So more people will also be investing in the product, in planting of cashews, and high yielding cashews, hybrid cashews, and we can be sure that cashews will always be there when there is a market, when there is support, and all of that. So I see, and then of course the consumption, as we know, keeps increasing. Cashews, constantly and continuously being considered as an healthy product. Definitely, we will continue to have cashews increase in production, and then of course in processing, and then of course in consumption. So you see, from one point to the other. So it will be a trajectory of growth and sustenance for everyone. More wealth, more cash for everyone in the value chain, in Africa and indeed the whole globe.
Thank you very much, Tola. The last person goes to Jim Fitzpatrick. Actually, you touched on it, whether imports are likely to slow in Vietnam. But the question now is asking again, what do you expect in the coming months in terms of the demand, or let's say imports by Vietnam of raw cashew nuts?
Well, based on just market factors, the demand for kernels, the exports of kernels, the processing capacity, and the current purchasing, you would expect to see imports this year higher than last year, perhaps reaching the record levels, maybe breaching record levels. Some people have mentioned figures of 1.8 million tons. How that plays out now is dependent on the impact of the pandemic in Vietnam. Vietnam has a really excellent record of managing the pandemic throughout 2020 and for most of this year so far. And if that continues, then I see no reason why imports shouldn't continue at the current pace and a pretty successful season all round. India too, depending on the management of the reopening of the economy and the return to demand and the question mark over a third wave and if and when that might occur, we should see Indian buyers behave relatively normally. So I think that we will see good demand for raw cashew nuts throughout the second half of the year, including through to the Tanzanian crop, but we must place a question mark over the impact of the pandemic in the processing countries. As Tola said, Vietnam has been the outlet and most important outlet for Nigerian cashews in particular, but also for Ivorian cashews. And we can hope that Vietnam manages the pandemic well enough and increases its vaccination program so that that can continue. So with that question mark, and it is a big question mark, of course, I would say I'd be relatively optimistic for the rest of the season. I think raw cashew trade will continue. It's not going to, go into a boom pattern, but prices should remain relatively steady. Trade should remain relatively good. And I don't see a situation where there'll be many end of season balances left in African countries by the time we get to September.
Thank you very much, Jim. I would like to, at this point, express our appreciation to Alex and Tola for giving us their insights into how the industry is functioning now, and particularly from their respective countries, how the actors are performing, from production all the way to export, and the optimism they also have in terms of how it's going to go. So at this stage, thank you once again to Ola, and thanks to Alex. So I come back to you, Jim, for your concluding remarks. Yeah.
Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to our two guests. I know they're two very busy people, and their taking time out today is really, really appreciated, and their commentary and their optimism is much appreciated, I think, by us all. Thanks to everyone who asked a question. Participation in these events is very helpful for us. From my side, I would just end on a note of optimism. I think that the African cashew sector and the cashew sector worldwide has come through the pandemic quite well so far. This is not an easy period for many people, particularly because of freight and logistics, but the industry is moving in the right direction. And I share the optimism of our two guests today, and I look forward to seeing a sector continuing to develop over the next 5 to 10 years. Thanks very much to everyone. Thanks to you, Ernest, and thanks to Blessing.
Thank you so much, Jim. And now I invite Blessing to also give us the...
Thank you very much, Ernest and Jim, and everybody that has joined us this morning. Also, soon we've come to the end of another encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick, which is the 10th session. We will nevertheless come your way again on the 14th of July for another encounter with Jim. So stay tuned and see you again. Until then, please stay safe and bye-bye.